Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the MMA Pick'ems podcast, where we'll be breaking down UFC Fight Night Ladd versus Dumont. And last week I did have a little spiel about not complaining about these cards, but I do have to say this card is looking pretty weak, especially the main event, arguably the two weakest fighters to headline a main event. And the rest of the card isn't looking particularly great either. But that was kind of what we thought about the previous card, and that turned out all right. And at the end of the day, I'm still going to watch this. And the fact that people are here to listen to this means they'll probably tune in for this card as well. So not really sure what I'm rambling on about. I guess just hang in there, because the next week we'll actually have a pretty solid card. And then the next few cards actually look pretty solid overall. Very stacked, especially going into the latter half of the month. So just hang in there. But before I get too ahead of myself, I do have to do the recap for the previous event. Overall, pretty decent betting night, actually. I think there's only one spot in there that I kind of flubbed. But without further ado, let's just break down the previous card, starting with the Steve Garcia-Charlie Ontiveros fight. So took the under on that fight, like I said I would. And honestly, that was actually a pretty weird spot for me, a spot where it looked like it was going to cash a few times and then looked like it might not cash. So Ontiveros was able to drop Garcia a couple of times early. And, I did say that the size difference definitely would play a bit of a factor here, considering Garcia coming up from 135 and Ontiveros coming down from 170. So, if Garcia felt the power of Ontiveros, I do think there was a chance he could have gotten dropped. And then Ontiveros, obviously, the guy has no heart. So if Garcia was able to start to pour it on Ontiveros, then Ontiveros would eventually break. But the fight was a little dicey because Ontiveros just had absolutely zero defensive grappling. And if Garcia wanted to, he probably could have just sat on top of Ontiveros and just grinded him out for, at least a few more minutes. And Garcia definitely did that the first round when he was recovering, and I was a little concerned he wasn't fully recovered, in which case he'd probably use a little more time to just lay on top of Ontiveros, but it looked like Garcia started to get his wits about him in that second round and eventually started to lay that ground and pound on Ontiveros and eventually get him out of there, just barely cashing that 1.5 under for me, so really happy that happened. And then Godinez, Silvana, Gomez, Juarez, so yeah, not a fight I actually looked into until a bit later in the week. And I'd actually ended up parlaying the fight goes the distance in this matchup. I thought that this was going to be primarily a stand-up affair. And while Godinez definitely looks like she's a very aggressive fighter with a bit of power, she hasn't really gotten any finishes except for that one submission finish, which she happened to pull off in this fight. But I thought that this would primarily just be a striking affair, a bit back and forth, Juarez looking to skirt on the outside worker kicks, and that this would just creep to the over with Godinez doing a bit of damage to Juarez. But, not much else to say here. Godinez able to pull off the armbar early, which, this shit kind of happens in women's MMA. Just had a pretty bad read here. Just figured the fight would stay standing. But Godinez probably saw something on the tape, thought she'd have a grappling advantage, and she took advantage of it. And honestly, I was just looking to parlay Randy Brown up with something, and I couldn't find anything else on the card I really liked. Probably should have just parlayed Godinez straight, but I thought that if this was a stand-up affair, the fight could get a little hairy with how I think Weasley Juarez is on the feet. But obviously it didn't play out the way I expected it to. Kind of talked about this a little more than I like to have, so let's move on. Charles Rosa, Damon Jackson. Ended up going pretty hard on Jackson. Ended up taking Jackson via decision as well. Again, like I said with Rosa, the guy just has not looked good recently. Even in his win against Justin James, he didn't look good. And Rosa, even though he's a black belt, has had a very, very bad tendency to play off his back. And Jackson kind of took advantage of that. But Rosa cheated his ass off that fight and still got dominated. So, fuck that guy. I hope he gets cut. But yeah, the fight more or less played out the way I expected it to. Took Jackson by decision as well. Because if there's anything Rosa is actually good at, it's, submission defense. And he's kind of tough, as we've seen from his fight against Bryce Mitchell. Mitchell had him in some really nasty submissions, had that twister locked in. But Rosa was able to tough it out and defend against a few other submissions. So in this fight, I did think that Rosa, even though he'd be, dominated in the grappling a lot, he would be able to survive. So yeah, just had a small little play on Jackson by decision as well. But moving along, Alexander Romanov, Jared Vanderaa. Not surprised whatsoever with the outcome. Obviously, the play probably should have just been Alexander Romanov inside the distance. Did not pull the trigger on that just because I guess his last fight really put him off him, so maybe a little biased. But, in hindsight, obviously that was the play. Vanderaa just not a really good fighter. And I think I might have actually taken a small shot on Vanderaa to win in round 3, which I think was like a 0.1 unit poke. It was at like plus 3,400. A little ridiculous considering, how much Romanov slows down. But obviously Vanderaa just not the guy to really be able to extend Romanov and really capitalize. So, moving along, Chris Gutierrez, Felipe Colares. Not too much to say here. Colares, I don't think is a good fighter at all. The guy just does not really bring much to the table. He's tough and can grapple a little bit, but he's not very effective anywhere on the feet. His striking just looked terrible. His grappling is terrible. Not very good at controlling opponents. Not really good at staying active, even when he's grappling opponents. So, this guy's god-awful. And, pretty easy fade on him taking Chris Gutierrez. I mean, Gutierrez didn't look particularly great in that spot, but I think Felipe just does not have the tools to be successful at the UFC level. He got very fortunate getting those 2 wins against 2 lower-level guys, 2 very unreliable guys. So, I don't see Colares getting any more wins in the UFC unless they match him up with some other bums. But moving along, Sabina Mazo, Maria Agapova. So I did take a shot on Agapova here. And had I known she was a meth head, I probably would have bet her even more. No, I'm just playing. Anyways, that was definitely a buy low spot there on Agapova. Like I said in my previous breakdown, I did think that Agapova was the better striker. Didn't think she'd completely just run away with it in this fight because Mazo really didn't have anything to offer on the feet. Agapova came in very strong. Not strong to the point where she was going to gas herself out, but enough to make Mazo really respect the power coming her way. I mean, she was more or less just landing at will on Mazo. And pretty solid bet there. I think the only concern I had going into that fight was the cardio of Agapova. But like I said before, Mazo just not really the fighter to make Agapova really work. And I did say that if Agapova kind of paces herself a little better, she would be able to go 2 pretty solid rounds against Mazo. And the fact that Mazo wasn't really returning anything, really making Agapova work in that fight either. I think Agapova was able to maintain a pretty solid pace. But I do have to say going forward, I would not completely write off the cardio concerns of Agapova because this was more or less like a one-way traffic sort of fight. So Agapova never really got much resistance coming her way from Mazo. So I do think the cardio concerns are still there, even though it didn't really show in this fight. I do think that another fighter that is maybe able to go to the grappling or is able to get off on their offense a little more will definitely be a tougher fight for Agapova. But Mazo just wasn't able to do that with her kicks. So yeah, pretty solid bet there. Probably could have gone an extra quarter or half a unit. But at the end of the day, Agapova does have some concerns about her, which made me not put as much as I'd like to. But moving along, Tim Elliott, Matheus Nicolau. Apparently I've been saying his name wrong the whole time. That fight actually played out a little closer than I had expected. Nicolau did start off a bit slow, which is going to be a bit concerning going forward. Elliott won that first round. Second round and third round, I did score to Nicolau, but I was a little nervous that fight because some of the judging is a little whack sometimes. Like I was maybe about 30-40% sure some of the judges might have scored that round to Elliott just because of the potential output he was landing. But I'm glad they got it right there. Nicolau, I think, was landing the much more effective shots, the much harder shots, much cleaner shots, even though his work rate wasn't as high as Elliott's. So Nicolau was able to get the win like I expected him to. Thought there would be a little more grappling, which is why I also took a small shot on Nicolau by submission. It was at like plus 400, which I thought was a little high because Elliott has shown to want to take fights to the ground. Same with Nicolau. So I figured if this was a somewhat grapple-heavy fight, Nicolau would potentially find the submission on Elliott, who does have a habit of putting himself in pretty bad spots. He has a habit of kind of tiring himself out on the ground and eventually getting subbed. So, I thought that if the fight had gone to the grappling a little more, Nicolau would find the sub, but obviously Nicolau very comfortable on the feet and was able to win a pretty sound striking decision. But moving along, Randy Brown, Jared Gooden. I did actually have Brown in a parlay, but the other leg didn't cash, so this didn't really matter. But yeah, I just felt that Brown was just an all-around better fighter than Gooden. Gooden was more or less knockout or bust in this spot, but I really didn't think Gooden was going to knock out Brown. I mean, he wasn't able to knock out, I'd say, inferior strikers in Abu Bakr and Joban. I mean, Joban's a solid striker, but at that point in his career, I thought that. I think and Randy Brown is a better striker at this point in his career than Joban was when Gooden fought him. So yeah, I just thought that with how competitively Gooden fought in his fights against Abu Bakr and Joban, that Randy Brown would most likely just style on Gooden. And I think had Brown not fucked up his toe early in the fight, he probably could have put it on Gooden a little harder. But yeah, Brown won a pretty sound decision there. Had that first leg cashed, I would have had a pretty massive night, but I think ended up with about 4 units, so, not too bad. Mackenzie Dern, Marina Rodriguez ended up not putting any action on this fight. I know I did pick Dern to win via submission in the previous episode, but I did feel that Dern ultimately was submission or bust. I did not think she was going to win a decision. Her most likely path to victory was to get Rodriguez down to the ground and get the sub. I wanted to take the submission line, but it was only I think plus 120 when I did eventually get to it. So I didn't think the odds were particularly great. And Marina Rodriguez actually did what we had wanted all of Dern's previous opponents to do, and that was to just keep the fight standing and just box her up. And in hindsight, obviously, this was due to happen. Dern was really fortunate to have a ton of opponents kind of just fall into her lap, like literally fall into her lap and, put that submission on a platter for her. And Dern was due to finally run into someone that could actually execute a decent game plan against her. I personally did not have the balls to step in front of Dern at this point, even though, the plus money on Rodriguez was getting pretty ridiculous, all things considered. But, good for anyone that did actually put money on Rodriguez there. In hindsight, that she was very clearly the spot. I had bought a little too much into the submission hype for Dern. I don't think she was really worth laying the juice. If anything, you probably should have just played Dern by submission in that spot. But yeah, again, just congratulations to anyone who took Marina there. And at the end of the day, Dern was able to get Marina down there in that second round. Did have a lot of time to work. Wasn't able to do too much with it, but, as a Dern supporter, that's really all you were asking for in that spot. Really unfortunate she wasn't able to pull it off, but Rodriguez showed pretty good sub defense. I know we shit on Rodriguez a lot for having poor get-ups, but she has generally shown, pretty good submission defense. And it definitely looked like Dern might have kind of gassed herself out in that second round, going a little balls to the wall with the submission attempts. And it looked like she was going for a really weird submissions too. So probably not the most efficient use of her energy in that spot. And outside of that second round, she pretty much had nothing to offer Rodriguez. And lastly, I do just have to add that there's just so much bias coming from the UFC. Like, it's so obvious, which fighter they're trying to push based off of the tweets that they show during the fight. Like, who are these clowns anyways? I don't know how they keep getting exposure, but I feel like their scores are off about 90% of the time. Like, a number of those guys scored it a 10-8 round for Dern in the second round, which is pretty ridiculous. Anyways, the narrative that they try to push is kind of annoying sometimes, but that'll do it for me. Let's get into the breakdowns for this card. We only have 11 fights this week. Hopefully none of them fall off because the card is looking pretty sad at the moment. So without further ado, let's get right into this card. And kicking off the card, we have Ariane Carnelossi versus Istela Nunes. And Carnelossi's the minus 170 favorite. Come back on Nunes is plus 150. And I guess we'll start with Carnelossi. So I don't know if we can talk about Carnelossi without talking about her arms. This chick is fucking jacked. It's like they photoshopped her face onto Paulo Costa's torso. It's pretty ridiculous, honestly. But getting to Carnelossi here, she is pretty tenacious. I mean, who would have guessed, right? Fucking look at her, dude. But she will move forward. We'll definitely throw hands. We'll look to pressure opponents. And now that I'm actually saying this out loud, she actually kind of fights a bit like Costa too, but obviously, not as dangerous and not as skilled. But Yeah, she is someone who will move forward, super tough, but will eat a lot of shots as well. She was getting touched up quite a bit by Angela Hill, although that was her UFC debut, and Hill is a pretty solid fighter. But she did show a lot of toughness in that fight. Despite getting touched up, she did continue to move forward and was actually landing some of her own shots as well. But at the end of the day, it just wasn't enough. Hill was just way more experienced in there, was able to just clip her anytime she came in. And I believe the fight actually did end up getting stopped because of a pretty nasty elbow that Hill landed, just completely cut Carnelossi open. But it wasn't like a knockout where she was out cold or anything. It was a cut stoppage. Anyways, very tough fighter, and she showed a lot of toughness against Liang as well in her most recent fight. It looked like she might have been in a little trouble early. I don't know if she was in a nasty submission or anything, but she was in a pretty bad grappling position. But she was able to weather the storm for that first round and eventually just break Liang in the second round. So yeah, she's not super technical, not super skilled or anything, but she is aggressive, she is tough, she is gritty, and I feel that's a pretty good attribute to get you pretty far in the UFC for women's MMA. So yeah, she's a jacked, gritty Brazilian chick. 10 out of 10 would let her speak to the manager if she ever asked. But moving along to her opponent, Istela Nunes. So she's got a Muay Thai base. Does appear to be the more technical striker of the two. She's got a nice check left hook. Very good kicking game, obviously. Nice little hip feint she throws. And she's got a very nasty clinch game, very very vicious knees in the clinch. Honestly, she's got some skills offensively. That said, though, she doesn't do a really good job of setting up her kicks. I have seen opponents just land some pretty flush counters on those kicks. Actually sat her down a few times, but that was a few years ago, and that kind of leads me to the other red flag about her. She hasn't fought in I think 2.5-3 years, so a large layoff for her. She was scheduled to fight a number of times before, but hasn't been able to make it to the octagon. And I do have to say, though, she's just kind of young. She's still only 29, so I don't think the ring rust and the time off is going to be as bad for her as it is for someone who's a bit later in their career. So I do think that the time off is probably, I guess, good for her development overall, but it's just a little concerning as far as the ring rust goes. But taking a look at this matchup, I do feel this might actually be a somewhat favorable matchup for Nunes. And, I'm not saying this is going to be an easy fight for her whatsoever, but I do feel that with how aggressive Carnelossi is and how much she likes to move forward, I think it's going to leave a lot of openings for Nunes to hit the counters. Nunes isn't particularly high volume, but, with how aggressive Carnelossi is, she's kind of the fighter that kind of forces you to fight at a higher pace. And again, she's going to leave a lot of openings, and I do think that Nunes will be able to capitalize on those. And we did see Hill have a lot of success with that against Carnelossi. Anytime Carnelossi came in a distance, Hill was able to just land an elbow or just touch up Carnelossi. And obviously, Nunes isn't quite at the level of Hill, but I do feel that Nunes does have a similar skill set and similar build of Hill to kind of replicate that sort of game plan. So yeah, I do think that Nunes has got a pretty decent chance of winning the fight here. I think that her being a slight underdog might just be predicated on the fact that she's not really been all that active and she hasn't exactly fought the highest level of competition, but neither has Carnelossi, if I'm being honest. I think her toughest opponent was probably Hill, and she lost that fight, I think, pretty convincingly. Had it even gone to a decision, I do think that she likely loses. She was taking just way too much damage. And with someone like Nunes, obviously not as skilled as Hill, but I do think that Nunes is decent as far as her striking goes. So I think Nunes can capitalize. I think that Nunes shouldn't be this big of a dog. I think it honestly should be closer to pick'em, but she's coming off a really long layoff, and Carnelossi is someone who will move forward and is someone who will throw volume. So by default, I guess you do have to line her as a slight favorite, but just not this big of a favorite. So I am actually going to go with Nunes here to pick up the win. I do think that Nunes will likely just be landing at will on Carnelossi, and unless Carnelossi is able to mix in like the wrestling, the grappling, I think that on the feet it should be pretty competitive, but I am ultimately going to slightly lean towards Nunes to be able to do a little more damage to pick up the decision victory here. Moving along, we have Brandon Davis versus Danaa Batgerel, and Batgerel is the minus 200 favorite. Comeback on Davis is plus 170, and we'll start with Davis. The return of Brandon Davis, he was in the UFC for a little bit, got cut, racked up a few wins outside of the UFC, and then now is back. So the guy is primarily a striker, but he does have a bit of wrestling to go to. On the feet, he's got some pretty nasty leg kicks. He's got decent hands as well, but I feel like his offense does comprise mainly of the low leg kick. And like I said before, he does have a bit of wrestling that he could throw in there as well. I don't think he's like a phenomenal wrestler or anything, but he has well-rounded enough wrestling to mix it in to be pretty aggressive with it. And he has shown a pretty good, gas tank. So it is something that he can mix into his game without, completely gassing himself out. And it's pretty well-rounded, honestly. I'd say his biggest hole is probably his defensive grappling. Granted, he has fought some pretty high-level, grapplers, but from what I've seen, I don't think his takedown defense is particularly good, and he does give up, a decent amount of control time when he is taken down. But, you do have to keep in mind that a lot of the grapplers that I've seen him fight are pretty high-level guys. Ultimately, I do think that Davis is a pretty decent fighter. I'd say he's probably on the higher end of like a regional fighter, borderline UFC caliber, I'd say. I don't think the guy's bad or anything, but I do feel he's more of like a UFC level gatekeeper sort of guy. And I know people are going to mention that he's got some pretty tough matchups in Chikadze, which was a fight he arguably could have won. And then, he got matched up with the likes of Barzola and Zabit and stuff. So not easy matchups, but, the guy's also losing to guys like Kal Bochniak. So, not a great look. And, if I'm being honest, the guys he's beaten aren't particularly great either. 2 punching bags in Steven Peterson and Austin Arnett, and then Randy Costa, who basically can't win outside of the first round. But look, he's showed good toughness, and, he's actually, I think, a decent fighter. It's just, they cut him for a reason. I don't think he's, like, fantastic or anything. So, Davis, well-rounded fighter who's really tough, really gritty. He'll be going up against Batgerel, who is primarily a striker, someone who's, I'd say, got pretty good hands, pretty dangerous striking. He's got good feints on the feet, pretty good counterpunching as well. Super dangerous left hook. But ultimately, I do think he is a little green and a little unproven. I think the sample size that we're working with is kind of limited. He's coming off of 2 quick knockouts, both pretty spectacular. But you do have to consider it is against Kevin Natividad, who is honestly kind of chinny, and then a 40-year-old Guido Canetti. So, while it's never bad to have 2 quick knockouts, you do have to be a little cautious laying the juice on someone who's coming off of 2 like pretty viral knockouts. Anyways, outside of that, he does seem to have pretty decent volume, but I do think he's still a little green and a little one-dimensional with the striking. But as far as this matchup goes, though, I do have to slightly lean Batgerel. I like the power and the accuracy coming from Batgerel. I like his volume. I think he's probably the quicker fighter in there as well. I think he's definitely got the knockout upside. But I don't think he should be this big of a favorite. Davis is a dog in there, and I do think he's got some pretty devastating leg kicks. I do think that'll definitely help him a bit in this fight. And Davis is someone who will mix in the wrestling as well. So, if he's completely outgunned on the feet, I do expect him to make this a pretty just dirty, grindy sort of fight. However, Davis is a bit hittable. He's showed pretty good durability so far. He's never been knocked out, but I have seen him rocked. I have seen him wobbled. And, if you're eating a clean hook from someone like Batgerel, he's going to put you out regardless of how durable and how cast iron you've been. So I do feel that if this was 100% a striking fight, I would favor Batgerel here a little bit more. I think that Batgerel is going to have the more power. I think he's probably going to be landing a bit harder, landing a bit cleaner, probably just doing a bit more damage overall on the feet. However, I do expect Davis to probably mix in the wrestling a bit, chop at the legs of Batgerel, and then look for an opportunity to close the distance, mitigate some of the damage from Batgerel, and hopefully get a bit of control time and just kind of grind out a decision. Ultimately, though, I am gonna side with Batgerel here. I think that the fight should be standing long enough for him to win on the cards, but I do think the odds are a bit wide, and minus 200 on Batgerel is kind of ridiculous. I think he'd have to touch Davis up pretty bad, possibly even knock him out to really pay off that price tag, and I just don't think that happens at too high of a clip. It is definitely a possibility, but minus 200 for Batgerel, definitely wide. And I might actually end up putting a unit on Davis here at plus 170 because, plus 170 is actually pretty ridiculous. I do think there is a path to victory here for Davis. As long as he doesn't get knocked out, I do think he can make this a pretty competitive fight. So the pick is Batgerel, but I do feel the value is on Davis right now. And in the next fight, we have Nate Landwehr versus Ľudovít Klein, and Klein is the minus 290 favorite. Comeback on Landwehr is plus 245, and I suppose we'll start with the underdog in Landwehr first. So Landwehr is primarily a striker, primarily a brawler, actually. The guy likes to move forward. He likes to throw volume, but is super hittable, and he's definitely one of these guys who will take one or two to give one, and it lends to a very fun style, very entertaining, but that it's not good for him, honestly. He took a lot of damage against Elkins, and even though that fight was really entertaining, it just wasn't a very good look on his end. He took over, I think, 120 significant strikes against Elkins, so that's definitely not good for his chin. And speaking of, I do feel his durability is starting to go a bit. He has been knocked out a couple of times already, and then there are actually a few fights where I've seen him rocked, seen him wobbled, so I feel like the durability is starting to go, especially considering all the damage he's taken throughout his career. And not to mention, the guy's face has been a knee magnet lately. He's gotten 2 knockout losses via knees, one to Erosa and then one to Burns. So yeah, the guy is super hittable, and 2 knockout losses from knees just really makes you wonder how his durability is going to hold up. And he's going up against Klein, who's actually a pretty dangerous striker. I don't think Klein is like a massive power puncher, but he does have a really nasty head kick. And obviously, if one of those are to land, I do think he could put Landwehr out. But, Klein, like I said before, he is primarily a striker. He's got a nice jab, but I feel like a lot of his offense really is coming from those kicks. He's got a nice teep kick, nice head kick that he likes to throw also. He does do work with his hands, but I do feel like he does the most damage with his kicks. However, I feel that he can be a bit low volume as, he's trying to set up some of those kicks. I haven't seen much from his defensive grappling, but it does look like he's got a little bit of offensive wrestling he could go to. He was hitting a few takedowns against Trezano in his most recent fight. Didn't have too much success there, but he was able to hit a few takedowns, just not a ton of control time. But yeah, this is a pretty interesting matchup. I think that Klein for sure is the more technical striker. I do think he's probably the heavier hitter as well. His striking definitely is a bit tighter there, and I do think defensively he's much better than Landwehr. However, I do have to give the volume and the aggression and the pace to Landwehr. He's shown pretty good cardio throughout his career, and I think he is someone who could fight at a pretty consistent pace for 3 rounds. But, taking a look at this matchup, I do definitely have to favor Klein, especially with how hittable Landwehr is. But I definitely do feel the line is a bit wide. As we've seen from Klein, if he's not getting the knockout, the guy isn't a particularly high-volume striker. And Landwehr is someone who will move forward, who will pressure, and obviously it's gonna leave a lot of openings for Klein to get that knockout. And There is a good chance that Klein does get the knockout, right? But if he doesn't, then this fight will definitely be very close if it goes to a decision. Like, if this goes the full 15, I definitely see Landwehr outworking Klein. The guy's pace and volume is pretty crazy, honestly. And I think that the aggression and pace of Landwehr might give Klein a bit of trouble, because we did see in Klein's most recent fight, he does struggle a bit when he's on the back foot. He's not as effective when fighters are crowding him, and Trezano did just that. Trezano was pressuring Klein the whole fight, and Klein wasn't able to get off on too much of his shots. So I think if Landwehr does that, he could definitely mitigate some of the damage coming from Klein. So yeah, I think that if Landwehr starts aggressively and just looks to crowd Klein, give him very little space to work, he could definitely make this a pretty competitive fight. But with how hittable Landwehr is, I do think that this could potentially be a highlight reel KO for Klein. But if that knockout doesn't materialize, I do think that Landwehr can make this a very competitive fight. So I am going to pick Klein here to win by round 2 knockout, but I don't think I'll bet him at minus 300. Don't even think I'll put him in parlays. If anything, I might actually put like half a unit on Landwehr, or even Landwehr by decision if the line gets any wider, because as it stands, I do feel the line is a bit wide. Moving on to the next fight, we have Sijara Eubanks versus Luana Carolina, and there are still no odds out for this fight yet, so I'll give my odds for it later after I break down both fighters. So I guess we'll start with Eubanks first. So yeah, if I'm being honest, I don't have the greatest read on Eubanks. She's kind of a pretty weird fighter for me. Like, I feel her fights generally aren't that close. I'd say outside of that Vieira fight, her fights tend to be a little lopsided. Whether it's she's winning or losing, she's either I'd say running away with it, or she's getting beat pretty soundly. So a fighter that I'd say doesn't usually fight super competitively. And I think the reason for that is I think her cardio is a little suspect, which kind of makes her fights a little volatile. Like, I mean, if you look at some of her wins, it's against some pretty low-level opponents. I'd say her best win is probably her win over Avila or Lauren Murphy back in the day. But that fight against Avila kind of exposed Avila a little bit. Like, Avila's a pretty decent prospect, but it looked like she kind of tired herself out after that first round and really didn't show much defensive grappling. So, while I do still think Avila is a decent prospect, I don't think she's as good as people make her out to be, but, still a decent win on Eubanks' part. And then back in the day, she did get a pretty solid win over Lauren Murphy, who has most recently been in a title fight. But her other wins, Roxanne Modafferi, Sarah Morris, Elise Reed, not exactly the best fighters, and even some of her losses aren't that great either, like losing to Betch and Vieira, who I honestly don't think is that great. But yeah, just not the greatest read on Eubanks, honestly. But as far as what she brings to the table, she's a bit of a marauder in there, very tough, very gritty, will move forward, does pack a punch, and can definitely mix in the grappling as well. So a pretty well-rounded fighter on her end, but she's not super technical in there, not very high level, just someone who is, generally pretty tough, but does seem to struggle a bit in the cardio department. And at the end of the day, she's a 7-6 fighter, so not very impressive overall. Decent competition, but come on, 7-6, it's pretty bad, honestly. But she'll be going up against Luana Carolina, who honestly I would kind of classify as one of these lower level fighters, more along the lines of potentially the Sarah Morris's, Elise Reed's. Maybe not as bad as them, but maybe just a step up. Not a great fighter in her own right, but as far as what Carolina brings to the table, she's primarily a striker. Honestly, her striking isn't particularly great. She stands a bit tall in there. Striking is kind of loopy, does get a little wild, and I honestly don't think she's all that athletic either. And honestly, I haven't really liked how she's looked even in some of her wins. The Botelho fight most recently, it was a very just sloppy, grindy sort of fight. And then even in her fight against Cachoeira, where she was kind of teeing off on Cachoeira in the second and third round, she didn't look particularly great in that first round. Very hittable. Didn't look like she really liked being hit, but Cachoeira started to slow down. So Carolina was able to capitalize, but Cachoeira is, again, not a very good fighter. She's historically just been a punching bag in the UFC, and if you can weather that first round from her, she basically just becomes a zombie, and you can more or less just tee off on her. And Karolina did show a little toughness that fight, weathering that first round, but not a performance I'd put too much stock in. But as far as this matchup goes, I definitely do have to side with Eubanks here. I'm not super high on Eubanks by any means, but she is the more battle-tested UFC vet, and I just think she's a little tougher in there. I really am not high on Karolina whatsoever. I don't think she'll like the power coming her way from Eubanks, and I think if Eubanks goes to the wrestling a little bit, works a bit of the grappling, I do think Eubanks can have a bit of success. We haven't seen too much from the defensive grappling on Karolina, but the one time that we did see her get taken down, or the one time that the fight did hit the mat, she got knee barred by Ariane Lipski, which is honestly a very, very bad look. Lipski's not a good grappler whatsoever, and that was just one of the weirdest submissions ever. So I don't think Karolina's any good on the ground. I think that if Eubanks is able to get Karolina down, she could look like a massive favorite here. I mean, I guess Karolina showed somewhat competent defensive grappling against Botelho, but Botelho is honestly not a great fighter. So again, I don't know if I can really take too much from that performance. And she actually kind of did struggle against Botelho. So it's honestly not a great look. But as far as how I'd line it, I'd probably put Eubanks at around like minus 200, minus 250, which, may seem kind of wide, but outside of Eubanks just completely gassing, I don't really see too much of a path to victory for Karolina here. And I'm not even saying I'll bet it at this number just because I feel that Eubanks is a bit unreliable, but I honestly don't think that Karolina is the fighter that'll really make Eubanks start to tire. I don't think Karolina is going to be able to put up the same sort of resistance as some of Eubanks' other opponents have. I mean, maybe Karolina might be able to out-volume Eubanks, but outside of that Cachoeira fight, there's really no indication of Karolina just being a massive volume striker. And ultimately, I just feel there is a pretty clear path to victory here for Eubanks. And as much as I do want to fade Eubanks, I just don't think that Karolina is going to be the fighter to do it. So I'm going to take Eubanks in the spot. I think Eubanks might actually be able to get it done inside the distance. Just take Karolina down and just pound her out. Not my most confident take, but, this is pretty low-level women's MMA, and I likely won't bet it unless I see a massive edge on either side, like either Karolina at like plus like 350 or more, or Eubanks, at like around minus 150. But I highly doubt those lines will be available. But more than likely, this will be a pass fight for me. Moving along, we have Danny Roberts versus Ramazan Emeev, and Emeev is the minus 230 favorite. Roberts is the plus 195 underdog. And I suppose I'll start with Emeev first. So Emeev, generally a pretty low output decision fighter, if I'm being honest. Not a particularly heavy hitter, not someone who will just pour on volume either, but his striking is serviceable. Nothing crazy though. He is someone who will generally look to get his grappling going to win fights, because if I'm being honest, I don't think he does too much. He is someone who is a bit reliant on just kind of grinding on opponents, holding them up against the cage or taking them down and just racking up control time. He's not even particularly busy in those control positions. He's really someone that will just prioritize the control time over anything else. And, he'll work just enough so that the ref doesn't break him apart. And, at the end of the day, the guy is a grinder. Kind of boring to watch, if I'm being honest, but I will admit it is pretty effective, which, is kind of the opposite of Roberts. Roberts, he is, I'd say, a somewhat exciting fighter to watch, but the guy is super unreliable. His striking is pretty dynamic. He does seem to have a bit of power, but the guy ultimately does have pretty questionable decision-making, pretty subpar defensive grappling, and I think the cardio is a bit suspect as well, which I think actually might be a factor as to why he's got poor decision-making, just not getting enough oxygen into the brain as the fight starts to progress. But yeah, the guy's got good power. He's got good hands. The only issue is you can't really trust him to keep a fight standing. He doesn't really fight to his win condition, and he will slow down also. So, definitely concerning in those aspects. But yeah, this is a pretty intriguing matchup between two jobbers. Honestly, I don't think both guys are particularly great. Both guys have been in the UFC for quite a while, actually, but none of them really have any notable wins. I think they've mainly just kind of been UFC level, like gatekeepers, probably. But yeah, man, taking a look at this matchup, I do think that Roberts is probably the better striker, but Emeev, I think, clearly is the superior grappler. Roberts does have a bit of offensive wrestling that I've seen him mix in, but honestly, I think he's kind of ineffective there. He has hit some takedowns, but he's not really great with the top control. And if anything, I do feel like that depletes his gas tank even faster. However, as far as this matchup goes, I do think that Emeev is going to be the guy that is a bit better at enacting his game plan. Emeev, pretty good at getting control time, just grinding out a decision. And again, someone like Roberts, who has pretty bad takedown defense, pretty bad defensive grappling. I think that once Emeev is able to get his hands on Roberts, he's going to be able to probably just hold him down for the remainder of the round. So yeah, I think this is a pretty favorable matchup for Emeev. Outside of Roberts potentially catching Emeev, coming in or something, I do think that Emeev should be able to grind out a decision. However, with someone like Roberts, who has been subbed, who has been knocked out before, that is definitely a concern. I don't know if I want to necessarily play the Emeev, by decision line. I know Emeev has historically been a decisionator. The guy will prioritize just control over anything else. But, if Roberts slows down enough, there is a chance that maybe Emeev is able to find the submission. I don't know about the ground and pound finish, but I do think the submission might potentially be live. But, I don't think it's too likely. I just think that if Roberts does slow down significantly, he could give up the submission. But more likely than not, I do think that Emeev is going to get it done via decision. And for as much as I dislike Emeev's fighting style, I really don't like watching him fight. He does play it pretty safe. So I do think that he wins at a pretty high clip. Honestly, outside of Roberts catching Emeev, I just think that he's just not going to have too much success. So give me Emeev to win, and Emeev to win via decision. Moving along, we have Andrew Sanchez versus Bruno Silva, and Silva's the minus 125 favorite. Comeback on Sanchez is plus 105, and I guess we'll start with Sanchez first. So Sanchez does come from does have a wrestling base, but he's been striking out of that karate stance quite a bit lately. And, on the feet, he does stay pretty light there, does stay busy. Definitely looks like he might have fallen in love with his hands a little bit. And, he's had pretty mixed results there. The fight versus Perez on the feet, obviously, mixed it up a bit against Marc-Andre Barriou, where, he did a pretty decent job striking, but also was able to mix in the wrestling a little bit. And then in his most recent fight, in his second most recent fight, he knocked Wellington Turman out. So, those are a few fights he did have a decent amount of success with the striking. But he is actually coming off of a knockout loss to Muradov, which, I'm not really sure what his strategy was going into that fight, because I'm not sure if he actually shot a takedown. I know he definitely didn't get the fight to the ground, but that fight was on the feet a lot longer than I'd have expected, considering I felt that Muradov was the far superior striker. So, Sanchez, I think, might have been a little too overconfident with his hands there, and then he ended up getting knocked out. But, it was still somewhat competitive, but I do think that Muradov was pretty comfortably winning that fight. Anyways, this kind of brings me to my next point about Sanchez, and I do think that Sanchez has got a pretty suspect chin at this point in his career. He's been rocked and wobbled a few times. He has been knocked out a couple of times as well, and that's definitely concerning going into this fight, since he is going up against Silva, who is pretty heavy-handed. I don't think Silva's got knockout power, like one-punch knockout power, but, he does like to pressure and just wing bombs on the feet, and if he is able to land a couple clean shots on Sanchez, I do think that he might just be able to swarm him and potentially get the TKO. But, on the feet, Silva, he is someone who is a little wild there, not super technical. He is someone who will do a bit of work in the clinch. On top, he's got very heavy hands as far as the grappling goes. Defensive grappling, honestly, is a bit suspect. He's been stuck on his back a number of times, and he's kind of pulled a lot of wins out of his ass just by, I guess, hanging around in the fight, putting up a bit of resistance, looking to just tire opponents out. And then, once they're spent, he'll just start just landing some nasty ground and pound on him. He was doing that on the Russian regional scenes. And then we saw him do it again in his UFC debut against Turman, where, they have a bit of wrestling success or a bit of grappling success against him early. But, the guy's really, he's really active with his defense. He really makes his opponents work. And, once his opponents start to slow down, he'll take advantage. He'll just start dropping hammers on them from top. And to me, I think Silva is a bit of an enigma. I do see a lot of holes in his game. I think that there are a lot of weaknesses that can be exploited, but the fact that he's able to keep pulling these wins out of his ass, I think, makes it kind of hard for me to want to fade him, especially when I'm not getting nice, juicy odds. And, if he only does it once or twice, you could say that maybe it's a bit fluky, but, he's repeatedly been able to pull this off. So I think there is a method to his madness. I don't know how exactly he keeps pulling off these fights. I don't know how he keeps lulling opponents into these sort of fights, but it somehow just happens. And I don't know if I necessarily want to fade him. I think that fading him might be a bit of a trap here because, when it comes to some of these fighters who are able to repeatedly pull these wins out of their ass, I think there is some merit as to, their skill and just how dangerous they are. So, yeah, not a particularly great breakdown here, but, I think I am going to side with Silva here. I just think he's a little more dangerous. And I think that Sanchez is a bit of a bed shitter, so I think this is a spot for him to potentially shit the bed. So I'm gonna pick Silva here. On the feet, I think it might be somewhat even. I definitely favor the volume and the output of Sanchez, but I do think that Sanchez is liable to get caught at any point. And should Sanchez go to the wrestling, I think that might actually just kind of play into the hand of Silva a bit. I think that he'll probably have a bit of success there as well, but I think if he starts to slow down at all, Silva will probably sense it. And, if Silva is able to turn the tides or if he's able to get on top of Sanchez, I do think that Silva can pound Sanchez out. So I am going to go with Silva here. I honestly think this is probably going to be one of those fights where Sanchez is going to be winning until he isn't. Sanchez should be the better minute winner here, but I do feel Silva is the more dangerous fighter. I think Silva's going to be dangerous at any point in this fight. There's not a lot of logic when it comes to breaking down these Silva fights, so I'm just going to go with Silva here. I think he gets it done by either round 2 or round 3 knockout. And moving along, we have Julian Marquez versus Jordan Wright, and Marquez is the minus 210 favorite. Comeback on Wright is plus 180, so I guess we'll start with Marquez here. The guy is, I'd say, primarily a striker, but, he does have a bit of grappling to go to. But generally, the guy will look to keep it standing. He's very aggressive on the feet, very explosive as well. Lots of power in his hands. But, he definitely can get a little wild in there, although, he definitely showed a slightly better composure in his most recent fight against Alvi. And, he kind of just did a pretty good job of picking Alvi apart there. But, if I'm being honest, I don't know if I could take too much from that performance because beating Alvi in 2021 is really not all that impressive. However, he did look pretty good that fight. I will give him that. But, going back to what he brings to the table here, I think Marquez, he is pretty hittable. And I think his durability might be taking a bit of a hit. He's never been knocked out, but he has been hurt. He has been wobbled before. He has shown pretty decent recoverability, but he's been wobbled before. So take that for what you will. I'm not going to completely write off his chin, but it is a little bit concerning, especially since I feel Wright in this matchup is he is pretty dangerous on the feet. But we'll get to that later. I want to continue with Marquez a little bit here first. So Marquez, pretty good toughness, pretty good heart. And I think he definitely showed that in his Pitolo fight where I think he was pretty thoroughly getting out grappled there, but he never gave up. Kept going for that sub attempt there and eventually got it. But yeah, the guy's just really tough. I mean, he's a dog in there, honestly. He got hurt in the Haas fight as well and came back from that. And then I believe against Alvi, I think Alvi actually kind of hurt him a little bit there, but he showed a really good poker face and was able to come back that fight. Well, I guess not come back because it's not like he was like seriously hurt or anything, but he was able to finish Alvi in the second round there. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not saying his chin is bad or anything, but I am starting to see a few cracks here, and I think that Wright might be able to take advantage. Wright, I do think, is pretty dangerous when he gets his offense going, and once this guy, once he smells blood in there, man, he'll pour it on. So Marquez definitely has got to be careful in this fight, but I'm just not completely sold on Wright whatsoever. I've been looking to fade this guy, and it kind of failed last time I pick it against him. I just felt that Wright is a bit of a fraud. I think that Wright is a bit of a front runner, honestly, and he's primarily just been a can crusher for most of his career. And I thought Pickett might have been the guy to get it done there, but Pickett just showed terrible fight IQ in that fight. Went for the takedown and then ended up eating like 6 or 7 unanswered elbows to the side of the head. He just way overcommitted on that shot, and by the time he decided to back up or back out, the damage had already been done. Pickett was hurt, and Wright ended up just swarming him for the finish. And that fight honestly didn't really answer any of the questions that I had for Wright going into that fight. The guy had a ton of red flags surrounding his record, some of his wins, or most of his wins. The guy was primarily a first-round finisher, and we never really seen him get tested, and I thought Pickett was going to be the guy to kind of test him a little bit. Obviously, that didn't pan out, and he's getting matched up against Marquez here, who I'd say is a pretty dangerous striker himself. So I feel like the bookies kind of see the same thing here, which is why Wright is still a pretty sizable underdog. And honestly, I can't argue with it too much here. I think Marquez is a pretty tough matchup for Wright stylistically, because Marquez does bring a lot to the table that Wright has struggled against. I think Wright is pretty bad against pressure fighters, fighters that can hit hard, fighters that could hurt him, because I don't think that Wright fights particularly well off his back foot, and I don't think Wright really likes to take damage. We saw in the fights that he did lose to Fluffy Hernandez and to Joaquin Buckley that when he starts backing down and taking damage, he's just not as effective. He does a lot better work when he's the one pressuring, when he's the one doing the damage. But if it's the other way around, I do feel he wilts a little bit. And Marquez is someone who will move forward, is someone who will pressure. And I do think that that will give Wright some troubles here. But with that being said, though, I do actually feel the line is a little wide, surprisingly. Because, again, I think that if Wright decides to take a little bit of initiative, I think if he starts to move forward a bit on Marquez, he could definitely clip and hurt Marquez. I know I've been discrediting Wright a lot, but I do have to admit the guy's got pretty decent power and pretty good killer instinct in there. So if at any point he is able to clip Marquez, I do think that he could potentially swarm for the finish. That said, though, I am still going to side with Marquez there. I think Marquez should be able to get it done. He's pretty, tough matchup for Wright, honestly. Don't think I'd bet him at minus 200 or more, because there's a chance that that Wright catches Marquez here. Honestly, I think the look might be the under. Actually, I think that with the way Marquez fights, he kind of invites a brawl, and with how much power both guys pack and how I think questionable both guys' chins are, I think that someone is getting knocked out. I am leaning it more so being Wright, but I think that Wright has got a chance himself. So the pick here ultimately is going to be Marquez. I have him winning by knockout, either round 1 or round 2, but I think as far as a play goes, the under or fight doesn't go the distance might be the look. Moving right along, we have Manon Fiorot versus Mayra Bueno Silva, and Fiorot's the minus 240 favorite. Come back on Silva is plus 205. And starting with Fiorot, I just have to say she is just an absolute savage in there. Big power with everything she throws. Has a very stiff front side kick, nasty knees and elbows in the clinch. Just a lot of power in general. And, she's out here basically just demolishing these chicks. And, That's really the only big knock against her. Not that it's her fault or anything, but it's really the level of competition. All of these fighters she's gone up against are really low level, not a lot of resistance. And so while Fiorot's, dominating these chicks out here, she hasn't really been tested, hasn't really, been up against any adversity. Her defensive grappling also hasn't really been tested. I'd say her cardio hasn't really been tested either. She has been extended into the second and third rounds, but hasn't really had a fight go the distance. And with how quickly she's running through these opponents, I don't think that her cardio's really even being tested all that much in the second or third rounds when, you're not facing a ton of firepower coming back. That said, though, she has looked really good against these lower level opponents, basically running through them like she should. So that's definitely undeniable and is definitely a good look. But the concern really is just the fact that she hasn't really been tested, hasn't really been pushed. And I do feel that her opponent, Silva here, is probably going to be the best striker that Fiorot has gone up against and will probably be her biggest challenge. So with Silva, she is very heavy-handed as well. Will look to chop at the legs. Has some really nasty clinch knees as well. Her and Fiorot are actually kind of similar fighters in that regard, both being very heavy-handed fighters, both who prefer to look to keep it, standing. Obviously, I do give Fiorot probably the strength and the power advantage, but I do feel that Silva might be potentially the better grappler, probably a little more well-rounded than Fiorot, whereas with Fiorot I feel she's primarily a striker, although with Silva she will generally look to keep the fight standing. But the reason I said that I believe Silva is probably the better grappler is because Silva did defend the submissions, the grappling against Robertson pretty well, was actually able to reverse Robertson and eventually find the submission. And she actually defended the takedowns pretty well against Montana De La Rosa as well. And actually did, I think, a pretty good job of working her way back up in a lot of those spots. However, Silva did actually spend a significant amount of time on her back against Marina Moroz, of all people, who, Moroz is primarily a striker. But I feel that was a pretty high-paced fight, and, Moroz was able to take Silva down later in the rounds, and Silva kind of, I think, might have just been a little too tired to fight her way back up. However, I don't think it'll be too big of an issue here. I think this fight will likely happen on the feet, and, as far as how this fight is going to play out, I do think it's a pretty interesting matchup. Again, like I said before, I think that this will probably be the best striker that Fiorot has gone up against, and I actually think this might be a pretty close fight, at least much closer than the line suggests. I think both are pretty heavy hitters. Fiorot obviously has looked a lot better and has shown to be, much more aggressive in there, which I definitely do think will look better, to the judges. But, it's been against really, really low-level fighters at this point. I would argue that Silva could definitely look good against the likes of Tabitha Ricci and Victoria Leonardo as well. I don't know if she'll get the finish. Maybe she will. Maybe she won't finish them as emphatically as Fiorot, but I do think that Silva would do pretty well against the likes of some of Fiorot's opponents as well. But with all that being said, though, I am still going to have to go with Fiorot. I mean, she's just looked too good so far. She's absolutely just ferocious in there. It's really hard to pick against someone like Fiorot, who's out here murdering these chicks. And on a side note, one thing I didn't like that I saw from Silva was how hittable she was against the likes of Moroz and to a certain extent even Montana De La Rosa. Even though De La Rosa is not really a striker, she was getting off on some of her strikes against Silva. So I would say Silva is pretty hittable, and against someone like Fiorot, that's not going to be good at all. She's probably going to take a ton of damage, if I'm being honest. But I do feel she'll get off on some of her strikes as well. But I just can't help but feel that Silva's probably going to get tagged up quite a bit here. So yeah, I am going to go with Fiorot here. However, I do feel the line is a little bit wide. I do think that Silva might be the value side here. I think that Silva can definitely give Fiorot a scrap. And, going into the later rounds when, Fiorot's going up against someone who's actually able to return fire, the fight's going to get very interesting, I think, going into the latter half of the fight. So yeah, the pick is Fiorot. I'm not really looking to bet it unless the line gets a little wider, in which case I might actually put a little bit on Silva. But I think this is a good matchup to see just how good Fiorot really is, right? This is a good test for Fiorot because I am actually pretty hyped to watch her fight just because this division is so devoid of prospects that it's really exciting to see someone come along who's shown some promise. And Fiorot definitely does do that. So yeah, really excited to see how she performs here. So yeah, I'm going to pick her, but don't think I'll be betting her this fight. Moving along, we have Jim Miller versus Erick Gonzalez, and Miller's the minus 200 favorite. Gonzalez is the plus 190 underdog. And we'll start with the underdog in Gonzalez first. So he does appear to primarily be a striker. It's a little wild on the feet, not super tight. Honestly, I don't think the guy's that good. He's primarily, I think, only crushed cans. Pretty much lost to anyone half decent on the regionals. And coming out of Combate, I really don't think he's fighting anyone of note. Honestly, I think Combate is probably one of the weaker promotions given just how big it is. Yeah, I just don't think the level of competition there is really good. And yeah, he does have a loss to Rafa Garcia, who's a bum. So yeah, this guy's honestly not very good. On the feet, he does have a decent jab he pumps out. Now, he's got some kicks. I mean, he's actually kind of big for the division, so I guess it's kind of good to see him using his size a bit. Does have a bit of wrestling I've seen him go to, but he's not super active on top. I don't think he's particularly great there. I've actually seen him just kind of stall opponents out if he isn't able to take him down. So yeah, just not a lot of great things to say if I'm being honest. His defensive grappling also does seem a little subpar. I've seen him just kind of struggle being held up against the cage, being stuck on his back a bit. So not a particularly great look considering he'll be going up against Jim Miller, who is a pretty proficient, pretty high-level grappler. But I guess for Gonzalez, maybe he does have a bit of power. But again, this is against some pretty low-level guys. And I just don't know how well that's going to translate to the UFC. And he'll be going up against a bona fide UFC veteran, a legend in Jim Miller. And quite frankly, I don't even know how this fight got booked. They're clearly not trying to push this Gonzalez guy. I don't think he's any good. So they're probably just giving Miller a retirement fight or something. Is Miller retiring? I don't know if I've heard any news on Miller, but it does look like they're giving Miller a bit of a layup considering Miller's on a somewhat rough skid lately. But yeah, I think we all kind of know the deal with Jim Miller. The guy's more or less got one round of cardio. As of late, he's more or less round one sub or bust. Outside of that, I don't think he's going to have too much success. I just think that outside of that first round, his cardio falls off drastically. I'd say maybe the Holtzman fight was the most recent fight that he had like a decent round outside of the first round. But, that was against an older Holtzman as well. Anyways, I don't know if it'll matter too much in this fight. I have a feeling that Miller might just be able to pull off that round one sub against this Erick Gonzalez kid. Gonzalez hasn't shown particularly good defensive grappling from what I've seen, and he has been subbed twice in the first round, actually. Wasn't able to find those fights, but, that's just not a particularly good look, especially since Miller is a pretty high-level grappler who has been known to, get those first-round submissions. So I think if Gonzalez's defensive grappling hasn't really improved, I do think that Miller is live for that round one submission. That said, though, I think the fight might get a little dicey outside of that first round should Miller not find that submission. Even though I'm not all that high on Gonzalez, I do think that with how much Miller falls off after that first round, he could definitely make it competitive. So I don't recommend laying the juice on Miller here, even though I think that Miller might actually be good enough to win at least 2 rounds against Gonzalez, because I just don't see much from Gonzalez that I like. But again, with how much Miller slows down, anything could happen. So I think the play likely is Miller round one sub. I'm not going to hate on anyone too much if they take Gonzalez here, because at plus 170, I think the odds are kind of juicy considering Miller is likely going to drop the last 2 rounds if he doesn't get that first round submission. But it's kind of hard to say because Gonzalez really has not looked all that great. So give me Miller, and give me Miller by round 1 submission. And in the co-main event, we have Andrei Arlovski versus Carlos Felipe, and this is lined as a pick'em right now. I know on some sites you could actually get Arlovski at as low as minus 105, minus 104. So I guess Arlovski technically a dog here, but we'll just call it evens here. Anyways, we'll start with Felipe first. So Felipe, he's primarily a striker. He's got pretty quick hands for his size, pretty crisp boxing. Does a decent job of mixing it up. We'll put some pretty nice combinations together. We'll look to rip to the body. We'll mix in some kicks occasionally, but the guy is primarily a boxer. His output is okay, but he does have pretty large moments of inactivity sometimes, especially when he's looking to taunt opponents and stuff. But defensively, he is a bit hittable, and as far as his grappling goes, it's pretty awful. Honestly, he's been taken down and controlled for significant periods. He struggles a bit in the clinch. He struggles when opponents hold him up against the cage. And I think it's kind of made worse by the fact that he doesn't really have a heavyweight frame. I think the guy realistically has got a middleweight frame. Middleweight frame. The guy's not really that big. He's just got a ton of flab. And, I think other bigger heavyweights can definitely abuse that, hold him up against the cage, put their weight on him, and really take advantage. He struggled, I think, in all of his fights against fighters who have actually just tied up with him. Anyways, he'll be going up against Arlovski, who is actually a natural heavyweight, unlike some of the other opponents that Felipe has gone up against. And, Arlovski, he is primarily a striker, a bit low volume himself, but, he is predominantly a counter striker. But, he does a decent job keeping busy with the jab and the kicks. And he's actually pretty good at kind of mitigating the volume of opponents. They never seem to really want to overcommit against Arlovski. And, I take that back. There are some that will overextend on him and be aggressive against him. But by and large, I think against middle of the road fighters or even lower level fighters, he's pretty good at keeping fights, pretty competitive, as long as he's not getting knocked out, right? Because, he's been finished a number of times. But anyways, with Arlovski, I know he is getting a bit older. He's got a bit of wear and tear, but I do feel he's still got it. I don't think, he's washed or anything. He's coming off of a win against Sherman, and I think he's actually on a nice little win streak here. Oh, no. He lost to Tom Aspinall in between there. It was a pretty weird choke that he gave up. Aspinall kind of blasted him early, but I think Arlovski didn't expect the choke. He gave his back and was a little taken aback by how quickly Aspinall was able to lock up that choke. But prior to that fight, he was on a little 2-fight win streak against Boser and Linz. So I really don't think Arlovski's done here. I think Arlovski's got, obviously the skill or the experience advantage. And with how he's looked in his past few fights, I do think he's got a bit left in the tank, and he's facing I think a much lower level opponent in Felipe. But this is a pretty interesting matchup. Arlovski did open as a slightly bigger favorite, I believe around minus 160 or so when when it opened up, and he's been bet down since then. It's a pick'em now, and I can kind of see why. I mean, Arlovski's fights do tend to be pretty close when they do go to a decision. And, Arlovski historically not super high output or something or anything. And, Felipe, he's on a nice little win streak. He's got good hands. So I can kind of see the angle of Arlovski just getting outworked by Felipe. But again, I feel that Arlovski is pretty good at suppressing volume. And I don't think that Felipe is just going to come out here and just completely outwork and outpace Arlovski. I think Arlovski's going to make Felipe respect him a bit. And, I do have to say Felipe's probably going to have the quicker hands, probably the slightly quicker fighter in there. But Arlovski is going to be the much bigger fighter, the guy who's much more naturally suited for heavyweight, the guy who's got a lot more power behind his shot. So I do think that Arlovski can definitely make Felipe respect his striking a bit more than some of Felipe's previous opponents, which, if I'm being honest, these guys are just bloated up middleweights as well. Because you look at some of the guys Felipe's beaten, Jake Collier, Justin Tafa, Jorgen De Castro, all guys who, I guess they're technically heavyweight. They're just, but they're really just big boys. They're Collier especially. He's fought before at middleweight. Justin Tafa, he might be the only one who I'd consider maybe a natural heavyweight. Although I think if this guy slimmed down, he could definitely make light heavyweight easy. If he slimmed down tremendously, he could probably make middleweight. But what I'm trying to say here is Felipe's beaten just a bunch of other bloated up middleweights like him, and he's taken him to split decision, honestly. Like Jake Collier, Justin Tafa, all really close fights against guys who aren't the highest level and guys who aren't, I guess, natural heavyweights. And none of those guys really respected the power of Felipe, and Felipe didn't really respect their power either. The fight with Collier was just very back and forth. Arguably could have lost that fight, and arguably could have lost the Tafa fight as well. But yeah, I'm not all that high on Felipe. I don't know why, this many people are betting him. But, I guess plus odds against Arlovski is never a bad look, I guess. But I do think that Arlovski should be the favorite here. I think that, I think he's got a pretty significant skill advantage, significant experience advantage. And I do feel the size is actually going to be a bit of a factor here. Even though Arlovski has been known to be a bit of a decisionator, I do feel like he's still got a lot of power. And, I just don't think he really sits down too hard on his punches anymore. But I do think that if he kind of sits down a bit and, lands a few clean shots on Felipe's definitely going to feel it. He's going to respect the power coming from Arlovski a lot more. And I think that's going to slow him down a bit. It's going to make him a little tentative to throw, especially since he is going to be the smaller guy. He's going to be closing, much more distance than Arlovski, obviously. And at the end of the day, I do feel that Arlovski can also maybe go to the grappling a little bit. And by grappling, I mainly mean like just clinch work. I don't think Arlovski's going to be shooting takedowns in there. But I do feel that if he decides to just tie up with Felipe, push him against the cage, I do think he can have a lot of success there. I think he could actually rack up a bit of control time against Felipe, who's going to be the much smaller guy. And we have seen Felipe struggle in the clinch, struggle against the cage against other fighters. So I think if Arlovski does that, he could rack up some control time, do a bit of damage, do a bit of dirty boxing in there. So I think Arlovski should be a moderate favorite here, honestly. I think the line that he originally opened up at was more or less correct. So yeah, I got Arlovski winning this. I think Arlovski does win a pretty clear decision here, but the line being bet down like this does make me a little nervous. So yeah, let me know what you guys think about this fight. Let me know if I'm missing anything, missing any crucial information in regards to this fight, because I do feel that Arlovski should be a slight favorite here. So yeah, give me Arlovski, and give me Arlovski to win via decision. And in the main event, we have Aspen Ladd versus Norma Dumont. Ladd is the minus 155 favorite. Dumont is the plus 135 underdog. Very unfortunate that the original booking fell through. I was really high on Holm in this spot, and honestly, I felt that Holm was a massive smash spot here. I don't think Dumont had any business being in the octagon with Holm, and even though Holm is a little bit older, I think that she had all the tools to just run through Dumont, honestly, make easy work of her. But that is neither here nor there. Holm wasn't able to make it to this fight, and Ladd is stepping up short notice for this matchup. And this is actually a really interesting short notice matchup. Ladd is coming up a weight division after missing weight pretty badly the week before. So while this is technically a short notice fight, I do think she's going to be in relatively decent shape. The only concern being that she's cutting weight for the second time in 2 weeks. But, cutting down to 145 probably won't be as rough for her as cutting down to 135. Anyways, I'll touch on that a little later, but right now I do want to go over what each fighter does bring to the table here. So Dumont, not a ton of tape on her, at least not enough for me to conclusively say what she does and doesn't do well, but from what I have seen, she does seem like a moderately well-rounded fighter. She could definitely strike on the feet, does have a bit of grappling to go to, but I really don't think she's shown that she's quite high level anywhere. Like her strikes, when she's on the feet, she kind of loads up a bit on him, a bit telegraphed, does seem to pack a bit of power, I suppose, but that's more so just based on the fact that I've seen her just wing some crazy bombs in there, not that she's actually knocked anyone out. So not saying that with the highest amount of confidence, but it does look like she has a bit of grappling that she will go to, particularly in that Megan Anderson fight. She was just cage pushing a lot early in the fight. Obviously, she did get knocked out there, but she did show a tiny bit of grappling early in the fight, and then against Evan Smith, where she did have a ton of top control time against Evan Smith, but that was against an Evan Smith who I think is a little bit undersized for the division, and Evan Smith, not a good fighter whatsoever. So take that for what you will. And then in her most recent fight, she won a split decision victory over Felicia Spencer, who I actually, bet against in that fight. The line was actually a bit ridiculous. Dumont was like a plus 170 underdog or something. And I think she pretty thoroughly outboxed Spencer. I don't know how it was a split decision. I think one of the judges were confirmed to have been smoking crack during that fight, but I felt that was a pretty clear decision for Dumont there. But while I do think that she won pretty clearly, it was still a somewhat competitive fight. And, Felicia Spencer's not a good striker. Felicia Spencer's more of a grappler. And the fact that it was that close on the feet leads me to believe that Dumont's striking actually isn't all that great. And I don't think her offensive grappling is all that great either. So I feel like while she is kind of well-rounded, I don't think that she's particularly high level anywhere. So you have to imagine why I was so high on Holm in this spot. But Dumont will be going up against Ladd, who is not the most well-rounded fighter. I'd say Ladd is a bit more of a specialist. As far as her striking goes, I don't think she's got much to offer on the feet. Generally, Ladd is just looking to wing some power shots to close the distance and get her hands on her opponents. Her striking defense isn't great either. She's pretty hittable, but generally she is going to look to get the fight to the ground. And when she's on top of opponents, she's like a goddamn gorilla there, just screaming and dropping hammer fists. So yeah, she's quite aggressive on top, maybe a little too aggressive sometimes, because I have seen her lose position just because she kind of overextends sometimes, gets a little too wild in there, leaves a lot of openings for opponents to scramble and get out of that situation. But yeah, overall, she is pretty aggressive on top, which you do kind of like to see in women's MMA. And sometimes it could lead to a stoppage if, they're not defending too much, because I do feel refs kind of stop fights a little early in women's MMA. So a little bit of upside there, but, she, again, can potentially overextend. But yeah, this is a pretty volatile matchup, in my opinion, just because there's a lot of variables from both sides. For Dumont, I think she's still relatively unproven. There's not a lot of footage on her, so I don't know what she really excels at. And then on Ladd's side, while I do think she's a little more proven, she's coming off of a pretty long layoff. She's going to be cutting weight twice in 2 weeks. She's going to be moving up to 145. So just a lot of red flags on Ladd's part. But taking a look at both fighters, I do think Ladd is potentially the better fighter, the more skilled fighter. I think she's a little more dangerous as well. But all these other factors do make me a little hesitant about betting Ladd, especially as a juiced favorite, just because, the long layoff, you just don't know how she's going to look, combined with the fact that, she's cutting weight for the second time after looking like death the first time she cut weight. So that's not a good sign either. And after a second weight cut, we don't know how her cardio is going to look. She hasn't been in a 5-rounder. She'll be fighting a 5-rounder against Dumont, who is, I'd say, a more natural featherweight. So yeah, just a lot of concerns on Ladd's side. And at the end of the day, I do feel Ladd is a somewhat one-dimensional fighter. She really thrives on getting the fight to the ground, but if she isn't able to get the fight to the ground, I do feel she's going to be at a bit of a disadvantage. And against someone like Dumont, who is going to be a bit bigger, a bit stronger, I think Ladd might struggle to get Dumont down as the fight starts to progress. But ultimately, we haven't really seen too much from the takedown defense side of Dumont. So, that's a bit of a question mark there. But if she has got like decent takedown defense, if she's got decent get-ups, then this could be a very, very tough matchup for Ladd. And even though I'm not particularly high on Dumont, I do think that she's got better striking than Ladd. So if this fight does play out more on the feet than it does on the ground, I do have to favor Dumont a bit more. But as far as the pick goes, I am going to have to side with Ladd. I do think she's a little more proven. I see her path to victory a bit more clearly here. But just way too many red flags for me to want to bet her as a juice favorite. I think if anything, the value might be on Dumont, even though I don't think Dumont is a particularly great fighter. I think that she's got tools to make this a pretty close fight, as long as she's able to survive the ground attack from Ladd. But, going into the third, fourth, and fifth round, if she is able to stuff a few takedowns, this fight could get very interesting. But ultimately, I will side with Ladd here, but I do feel the value side might actually be Dumont. And money has been coming in on Ladd once again, so I'm thinking the line might widen up a bit. And if I can get like at least plus 150 or so on Dumont, I might actually take a small shot on her. I just feel that this could be a very volatile matchup. I think if Dumont is able to weather the early grappling attack from Ladd, I think she might have a decent chance, but I would like a juicier number on her before I take the shot on Dumont.